I never imagined that a quiet morning on my front porch would lead me into one of the darkest and most unforgettable chapters of my life. But sometimes life twists in ways you never expect, and the smallest things end up carrying the heaviest meanings. And on that calm autumn morning, when the world felt gentle and the air carried the soft smell of fallen leaves, I found something on my doorstep that made my heart stop. A child's drawing, smudged and wrinkled, with colors that looked like they had been pressed down with a desperate hand. And at first I thought maybe it was just blown by the wind from some neighbor's yard, but as I picked it up and turned it over gently in my hands, I realized there was nothing random about it, because on the paper was a picture of a little girl standing alone under a dark, crooked tree, and beside her was a house that looked very much like mine, drawn in shaky lines as if someone had rushed through it. And above the house, in uneven letters, were the words, "Help me," written in red crayon that looked too heavy, too harsh, too full of fear for any child to draw without trembling. And for a long moment, I just stood there, staring at it, feeling something cold crawl slowly up the back of my neck, because I didn't have any children living with me, and I didn't know any child who would leave something like this. And as I looked closer at the picture of the little girl, I felt something deep in my chest tighten, because her eyes, though only tiny circles drawn in pencil, looked terrified, and her small hands were drawn as if they were reaching for something, maybe reaching for me, maybe reaching for anyone who would notice. And the more I stared, the more my heart whispered that this was not a joke, not a mistake, not something to ignore, but I still forced a breath into my lungs and tried to steady myself, because the mind plays strange tricks when fear begins to grow, and at that moment, I needed to believe there was a simple explanation, something ordinary, something harmless. But no matter how hard I tried to push down the worry rising inside me, it lingered, heavy and unsettling, like a shadow that refused to step away. I remember looking around the street, letting my eyes travel across the familiar houses, the neat gardens, the quiet windows, and everything looked so normal, so perfectly still, that it made the drawing feel even more out of place, as if something terrible was hiding behind the calm, waiting to be discovered. And I kept asking myself, why my doorstep? Why this picture? Why now? But I had no answers, only a growing sense that something was wrong in a way I could not yet understand. For a while, I just stood there, holding the paper lightly between my fingers, afraid that if I touched it too hard, it would crumble, afraid that if I let it go, the meaning behind it would disappear. But I knew in my heart that the meaning was already etched into me, impossible to forget. Eventually, I walked back inside, though my hands were shaking slightly, and I placed the drawing on my kitchen table and sat down in front of it like it was something fragile and sacred. And I kept staring at the little girl drawn in those thin, trembling lines, wondering who she was, wondering where she was, wondering what she was trying to say that words couldn't express. And a part of me, the quiet part of my soul that always seems to recognize danger before my mind does, kept whispering that she was real, that she existed somewhere close, that she needed help, and that this drawing wasn't a message drawn from imagination, but a message drawn from fear. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the silence of my house settle around me, and I tried to remember if I had seen any new families in the neighborhood recently, any child who looked lonely or scared, but nothing came to mind, only the memory of my street as it always had been, calm, predictable, safe. Or at least I had believed it was safe until that morning, but now that belief felt thin and fragile, as if it could crack with one more wrong breath. I picked up the drawing again, turning it slightly, and that was when I noticed something else, something I had missed at first because I was too startled. There was a small fingerprint smudged in the corner of the paper, faint but visible like the mark of a child's thumb pressed down too hard, maybe while crying, maybe while rushing, maybe while trying to hold on to the paper long enough to leave it somewhere someone would find it. And the sight of that tiny print made my throat tighten in a way I couldn't explain, because it made everything feel painfully real. I remember whispering to myself, "Who are you? Where are you?" Even though I knew the paper couldn't answer me. And yet I hoped in some strange way that by speaking the questions aloud, I might feel some kind of direction, some pull toward the truth. But all I felt was a deep uneasiness settling inside my chest like a weight that would not lift. I spent the next few minutes walking slowly around my house, peeking out the windows, looking up and down the street again, searching for any sign of movement, any hint that someone was watching to see if I found the drawing. But everything remained still, and the silence outside pressed against my windows like a thick blanket, making me feel even more isolated with the strange paper sitting on my table. I thought about knocking on my neighbors' doors to see if any of them had children who might have dropped it by accident, but a part of me held back, something inside whispering that I shouldn't rush, that I should be careful, that this might not be as simple as it looked. And deep down, I knew that the fear in the drawing, the fear in the way the lines were drawn, the fear in that tiny fingerprint was too heavy, too real, too urgent to be dismissed as a child's careless accident. So I sat back down, resting my hands on the table, staring at the picture again, and I felt a quiet responsibility begin to root inside me slowly, like a gentle voice telling me this had come to me for a reason, telling me I could not simply ignore it, telling me that someone out there, some child I had never met, might be counting on someone to notice, someone to care, someone to follow the trail that others might overlook. The drawing felt like a cry from somewhere deep in the shadows of my neighborhood, and even though I did not yet know where those shadows lay, I knew I had stepped into something I could not step back out of, and that thought made my heart ache with worry and something else, like determination. Because even though I was afraid, even though I didn't understand what was happening, I knew I would not turn away, not after seeing that picture, not after feeling the fear behind it, and not after sensing with a quiet certainty that settled deep inside me that this was only the beginning of something much darker, something hidden, something that would pull me into a truth I never expected to face. And if I had known then just how dark that truth would be, just how far it would pull me, just how deeply it would change me, I don't know if I would have had the strength to pick up that drawing in the first place. But life does not wait for us to be ready. It simply unfolds, one moment after another, and sometimes the tiniest moment, like finding a child's drawing on your doorstep, becomes the one that changes everything.
I grew up believing that quiet neighborhoods were the safest places in the world. The kind of places where children played on sidewalks without fear and where mothers stood on porches, waving at their kids as they rode their bicycles down the street. Maybe that was why, when I moved into this small town after my husband passed away, I felt a kind of comfort I had not felt in years. The houses were close enough to make you feel like you had neighbors, but far enough to give you peace. And every morning, the sun rose in a soft, golden way that made everything look kinder than it really was. I remember thinking that this was the place where I would grow old without noise, without chaos, and without any surprises that would shake my already fragile heart. I spent most mornings sitting by the window with a cup of warm tea, watching the children from the block walk to school. I did not know their names, but I recognized their little backpacks, their mismatched shoes, the way they laughed loudly even though the world often told children to quiet down. One girl always caught my eye, a tiny thing with curly hair tied into uneven pigtails. She wore bright socks, never matching, and carried a drawing pad tucked under her arm as if it was the most precious thing she owned. She never walked straight to school. She wandered, skipping in zigzags, looking up at the sky as if waiting for something magical to fall. I would smile without meaning to because she reminded me of my own son when he was little, back before life got complicated and before distance settled between us like fog on a cold morning. Even though I barely knew the girl, something about her felt familiar, like she was part of the rhythm of my mornings, a small piece of comfort I didn't even realize I had. The neighborhood talked about her sometimes, saying she was quiet, saying she didn't play much with the other kids, saying she liked to draw more than anything. I never thought much of it. Children were different, and that was fine. But a few months later, I would think about every small detail, every little thing I noticed about her. The slow way she walked, the careful way she held her drawing pad, the way her eyes sometimes looked far away, like she was trying to remember something she didn't know how to say. I didn't know it then, but I was paying attention in a way that would matter later, a way that would pull me into a story I never expected to be a part of. In those early days, I still believed that life would stay simple, that the world would keep moving around me gently and that nothing would ever show up at my doorstep except bills, newspapers, or maybe a stray cat looking for food. I didn't know that one morning, something else entirely would appear there, something small, something heartbreaking, something that would take the quiet life I had and turn it into a story I never asked to live. But at that time, in those peaceful weeks, I only knew comfort, routine, and silence. The kind of silence that feels like safety, before you learn it can break at any moment. I would sit near the window with my tea and watch the day unfold, believing the world outside was predictable. I had no idea that soon a simple drawing left on my doorstep would change everything I thought I knew about this place, about myself, and about the little girl with the mismatched socks who never looked where she was going.
I spent my afternoons much the same way, slowly settling into the quiet life that this small street offered me. I would sweep the front porch, water the small line of plant I'd placed along the railing, and sometimes wave at the neighbors who passed by. Most people on the block were polite, but kept to themselves, the kind of people who preferred soft smiles over long conversations. I understood them, maybe because I had also learned to carry my grief quietly after my husband's passing, tucking it into the corners of my days so no one would feel burdened by it. There was something comforting about living among people who didn't pry, who believed that privacy was a kind of respect. Still, every now and then, I found myself watching the house across the street, the house where the little girl lived. It wasn't because the family was loud or unusual. It was because something about that house felt still, too still. The curtains were always drawn, even on sunny days, and the porch light stayed on longer than it needed to. I rarely saw the parents. The father would leave early in the morning, his head down, his steps hurried as if he was always running late. The mother appeared only occasionally, usually when she was bringing the girl inside after school, her hand gripping the child's wrist a little too tightly. I tried not to assume anything. People had their own ways of living, and sometimes what looked odd from the outside was simply a family's private rhythm. But I couldn't help noticing. When you live alone, you begin to notice small things, details that others might overlook. And maybe loneliness sharpens the eyes in a way that makes you see more than you want to. I remember one afternoon when the girl dropped a page from her drawing pad while walking home. I saw it flutter onto the sidewalk, but she didn't notice. Before I could reach the door to return it, her mother was already outside, snatching the drawing off the ground with such speed that it startled me. She didn't even glance my way, just hurried back inside with the paper crushed in her hand. I stood there for a while, wondering why that moment unsettled me. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't alarming. But something about the tension in the mother's shoulders and the way the girl kept her eyes on the ground made my heart feel a little heavier. Still, I tried to let it go. I reminded myself that I didn't know them, that I shouldn't create stories in my head based on one strange moment. Life had taught me not to assume the worst about people, because sometimes the things that look like warning signs are just pieces of someone else's struggle. But as the days passed, more little things began to stand out to me. The girl rarely laughed anymore. She walked slower, dragging her feet as if the ground itself was pulling her down. She stopped carrying her drawing pad, and that bothered me more than I expected. It felt like watching a small light dim, slowly but surely. I wondered if she was lonely. I wondered if she felt invisible. I wondered if anyone at home asked her how she was feeling or listened when she whispered the things that children sometimes whisper when they think no one is paying attention. I wanted to reach out, to say something, to offer kindness the way older neighbors used to offer it to me when I was young. But the world had changed. You couldn't just walk up to someone's child and start a conversation without people becoming suspicious. So I stayed in my place, watching quietly, hoping the heaviness I saw in her eyes was only temporary. Around this time, I began taking longer walks in the evenings. I liked the way the street looked under the setting sun, the way the warm light softened even the sharpest corners of houses. Sometimes I would see the girl sitting alone in the small patch of grass beside her house, her hands resting in her lap, her head turned slightly, as if she was listening to something only she could hear. Whenever her mother stepped outside, the girl stood up too quickly, brushing off her clothes as if she had been doing something wrong. It made my chest tighten with a feeling I didn't know how to name. Part worry, part sorrow, part memory of how easily a child's world can shift without anyone noticing. And still, I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I barely knew them. I barely knew anything. But I also knew that children rarely sit that still unless something inside them has gone quiet. And I found myself watching her more often, not out of curiosity, but out of concern I didn't want to admit. If I had known what was coming, if I had known how deeply I would become involved, I might have paid even closer attention. I might have knocked on their door sooner. I might have asked her how she was, even if her mother would have frowned at me for that. But back then, all I had were small observations, tiny moments that seemed disconnected, insignificant. I didn't see the pattern yet. I only felt a gentle ache whenever I saw the girl walking alone. Life was still peaceful, still quiet, still full of days that blended into one another with comforting predictability, until the morning I opened my door and found the first drawing lying on my doorstep, a drawing I instantly recognized even though I had never seen it before. A drawing that would pull me into a story far heavier, and far darker than anything I ever expected to face in this quiet little neighborhood where nothing was supposed to happen. But that moment was still ahead of me. For now, I was living in the calm before the storm, unaware that everything I thought I knew about the family next door was only the surface of something much deeper and much sadder. As the weeks went on, I settled further into my routines, letting each day unfold the same way as the one before. I cooked simple meals, read old books I had always meant to finish, and kept the house clean in a way that gave me a sense of control over my life. Sometimes my son called, usually in a hurry, telling me he would visit when he had more time. I didn't blame him. Life moved differently for younger people. But the truth was that the silence in my home often felt heavier than I liked to admit, and watching the world outside became one of the few comforts I didn't take for granted. The neighborhood children were a reminder that life still had joy in it, even when it didn't reach my doorstep. Yet every time I looked out and saw the little girl from across the street, something inside me tightened. Her steps grew slower. Her shoulders drooped more. Even her hair seemed less cared for, tied in uneven knots that looked rushed, maybe even pulled too tightly. One afternoon, I saw her sitting alone on the curb, her knees pulled to her chest, her chin resting on top. Her shoes were scuffed, and her socks, once bright and mismatched, were now plain and worn. I remember opening my door and stepping outside, wanting to offer her a cookie or even a simple hello, but before I could cross the yard, her father appeared from behind the car, his voice low and sharp, calling her back inside. I couldn't hear his exact words, but the girl stood so quickly that she tripped a little before running toward him. He grabbed her arm, not roughly but firmly enough to make my heart drop, and led her inside without even glancing my way. The door shut behind them and the street fell silent again. I told myself families had their own struggles. Maybe they were going through something I didn't understand. Maybe the parents were stressed. Maybe they were trying their best in ways that didn't always look gentle. But the more I watched, the more I felt something was wrong, something small but steady, like a quiet alarm ringing far in the distance. I didn't want to be the kind of neighbor who judged others, yet the weight of concern pressed harder each day. Still, life continued, and I tried to find balance in my worry. I spent time tending to my garden, even though it was nothing more than a few potted plants that struggled to grow in the limited sunlight. I listened to the radio in the mornings and sometimes dozed off in my chair near the window, comforted by the soft hum of voices talking about things that had nothing to do with me. On weekends, I baked bread the way my husband used to like it, even though I was the only one left to eat it. It was during one of those slow, quiet afternoons that I noticed something else, something small but unsettling. The girl no longer walked to school with her usual wandering path. Instead, she walked in a straight line, her back stiff, her eyes lowered, as if she had been told not to look around. She didn't carry her drawing pad anymore, and that bothered me deeply. Children stop drawing sometimes, but not all at once, not when it's the thing they love most. And she had loved it. I could tell by the way she used to hold it against her chest, like a shield or a friend. Then one morning, as I was washing dishes, I noticed the mother standing on the porch, staring out at the street in a way that didn't look casual. She held a cup of coffee, but her hand shook slightly, and she didn't take a sip. She stood completely still, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. When the girl stepped outside that morning, the mother didn't touch her hair or adjust her clothes like parents often do. She simply opened the door, let the girl walk past her, and went back inside without a word. There was a heaviness in that moment that stayed with me for the rest of the day. It felt like watching a scene between two people who were carrying something too heavy to say out loud. That night, long after the sun had set, I heard a sound, soft, almost like a whimper, coming from the direction of their house. I stood at my window listening, unsure if it was the wind or something else. The street was dimly lit, the kind of darkness that made everything feel uncertain, and I couldn't be sure of what I heard. But once I noticed it, I couldn't forget it. Even though the sound stopped quickly, it settled in my mind like a weight I couldn't lift. And yet nothing I saw was clear enough or strong enough to call for help or knock on their door. It was all small things, subtle things, things that could be explained away if someone wanted to. So I didn't act. I stayed quiet. I waited. But deep down, a quiet fear was beginning to grow inside me.
A fear that something was happening in that house, something hidden behind those always closed curtains, something that the little girl didn't know how to speak about. I didn't know it then, but the truth was already reaching toward me, already pulling me into its path. And soon it would show up at my door in the form of a small drawing left on my doorstep, a drawing that would unravel the silence of the street in ways I could never have imagined.
I remember the exact moment the shift happened, the moment when everything I had been quietly sensing finally reached my doorstep in a way I could no longer ignore. It was a cold morning, the kind where the air feels heavy and the world looks washed out. I opened my front door to pick up the newspaper, still half drowsy and thinking about nothing in particular, when I noticed something lying near the welcome mat. At first, I thought it was just a piece of trash blown by the wind, maybe a scrap of paper from someone's recycling bin. But when I bent down and picked it up, I realized it was a drawing, a child's drawing, the kind made with cheap crayons where the colors pressed into the paper so hard that little wax flakes came off in your hands. I turned it over gently, almost afraid of what I might see, and my heart tightened when I recognized the style immediately. It was the little girl's. The same uneven lines, the same bright colors, the same shaky but hopeful way she used to draw the trees. Always a little crooked, always a little too tall. But this drawing was nothing like the cheerful ones I had seen her carry before. It showed a small house, clearly their house, drawn in black crayon. Heavy, dark strokes as if she pressed the crown down with more force than a child should. Above the house were shapes that looked like storm clouds, drawn in messy circles. And in front of the door was a tiny figure, a little girl with wide eyes and a downturned mouth. Next to her stood a taller figure, scribbled over completely in black, without a face. My breath caught as I stared at the paper. Children don't draw darkness unless they feel it. They don't draw fear unless they've known it. And they don't leave drawings like this on doorsteps without meaning to say something. My hand shook a little as I held it. I looked around, scanning the street, hoping, maybe even praying that she would be somewhere nearby, but the street was empty. No sign of her. No sign of anyone. I slipped the drawing inside the house quickly, as if hiding it would somehow protect her. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept thinking about the scribbled-out figure, the little girl drawn with those sad eyes, the storm clouds that didn't belong in a child's imagination. I tried convincing myself it was only a harmless drawing, something she made in a bad mood, something with no deeper meaning. But the more I replayed the image, the more wrong it felt. Children express truth in simple ways, often clearer than adults ever do. By afternoon, I saw the girl again. She was walking home from school, but this time her steps were slow, almost dragging. Her backpack hung loosely from one shoulder, the strap twisted. She kept looking down at the sidewalk, her shoulders hunched. And then something happened that made my heart drop. When she passed my house, she lifted her head just slightly, just enough for our eyes to meet for a brief moment. Her face didn't show surprise or fear. It showed pleading. Quiet, wordless pleading. Her eyes flicked toward her own house, then back at me, just for a second. Then she looked down again and kept walking. It wasn't the look a child gives by accident. It wasn't the kind of glance that comes from shyness. It was the look of someone who wanted to ask for help but didn't know how, someone who couldn't speak but desperately hoped someone could see. I closed my door slowly after she passed, leaning against it, trying to steady myself. The setup for everything that would follow was already laid out in front of me like puzzle pieces, each one small, each one quiet, each one easy to ignore if someone wanted to. The closed curtains, the stiff walk, the rushed hair, the shaking mother, the nighttime sounds, the drawing, the look, they were all whispers pointing to something hidden, something painful, something happening just beyond the thin walls between one house and the next. I didn't know the whole truth yet, but the weight of it pressed against me with every passing hour. And deep down, I realized something I'd been trying not to admit. I was already involved. I was already part of whatever was happening, and soon I would be pulled into it fully, into a story that would test my courage, my judgment, and my heart. Because the missing child's drawing was not just a warning, it was a cry that had found its way to me. And whether I was ready or not, I was the one who had to answer it.
The day after I found the drawing, I woke earlier than usual, my mind already circling around the same thoughts that had kept me awake half the night. I couldn't stop thinking about the heaviness pressed into that small piece of paper, the way the little girl's eyes had met mine, the silent message tucked between those lines of crayon. It was strange how something so small could sit so heavily on my heart, but I've learned that sometimes the quietest signs carry the loudest truths. That morning, I watched from my window as the girl left her house for school again. Her steps looked even slower than the day before, and the backpack that hung from her shoulders seemed too heavy for someone her size. I told myself I should go outside and talk to her, at least offer a smile, but by the time I opened my door, she was already halfway down the street. Her father stepped out right after, watching her walk away with an expression I couldn't decipher. There was something in the way he stood, still, tense, like someone guarding something rather than guiding someone. When he turned his head slightly, as if feeling someone watching, I stepped back inside quickly, almost embarrassed, even though I had done nothing wrong. I spent the rest of the morning in a fog of worry, unable to focus on anything. I kept remembering the way the girl had glanced toward her house and then back at me, as if hoping I understood something she couldn't say out loud. Was the drawing left intentionally? Was she asking for help? Was she scared? Or was I imagining everything, letting my loneliness and quiet days turn ordinary moments into something they weren't? I needed clarity, but the truth didn't show itself easily. Later that afternoon, I saw the mother again. She was standing outside for a brief second, holding a trash bag, her eyes red and tired. She didn't look at me. She barely looked at anything. She tossed the bag into the can and quickly went back inside, moving like someone who wanted to avoid being noticed. I watched the door close and felt that same quiet alarm inside me rising again. Something was wrong. Maybe not something dramatic or loud, but something persistent and painful, like the sound of water dripping in a place it shouldn't, slowly causing damage no one sees until it's too late. As the hours passed, I kept thinking about the drawing. I pulled it out again, smoothing the crinkled edges, studying the dark scribbles. The face of the tall figure was nothing but overlapping black lines pressed so hard into the paper that some parts had torn slightly. Children don't erase faces like that unless they fear them, and the little girl drawn next to it, she had no smile, no color in her dress, no sun in the sky, just storm clouds. Heavy, messy clouds that took up half the page. I set the drawing down slowly, my heart feeling heavier than before. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't family. I wasn't a teacher. I wasn't someone with authority. I was just an older woman living alone, watching from the window, trying to make sense of something that didn't belong to me but wouldn't let me go. But then something happened that pushed everything further, something that made the quiet signs impossible to ignore anymore. Just after sunset, when the streetlights flickered on and the air grew cooler, I heard a sound again, coming from their house. This time it wasn't a whimper or a faint noise that could be blamed on the wind. It was a soft thud, followed by a muffled cry, short and quickly silenced. My stomach twisted. I froze where I stood, every part of me alert. I told myself maybe someone dropped something. Maybe the TV was on. Maybe the girl had fallen. So many maybes, yet none of them settled right. I moved closer to the window, keeping the curtains slightly parted, and watched their house. It looked normal from the outside. The porch light was off, the curtains were tightly shut. But the silence felt unnatural, like the house was holding its breath. I stood there for a long time, listening. And then came another sound, quieter this time, like a sharp inhale followed by stillness. My heart ached. Something inside me whispered, "This isn't your imagination." I took a step back and pressed my hand against my chest, trying to calm myself. But no matter how hard I tried to reason with the situation, the worry inside me only grew. How much was I supposed to ignore? How much was I allowed to interfere? What if something truly bad was happening and I did nothing? What if she needed someone, anyone, to notice? I didn't sleep that night. I sat near the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching their house as if the answers would appear if I stared long enough. Hours passed slowly, and the night made everything feel heavier, sharper. When dawn finally came, I felt exhausted, but determined. I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. I had to at least find a way to understand what the drawing meant, whether it was a message, a mistake, or something darker. So when the girl came out for school, I stepped outside. My heart thudded with nerves. I didn't want to scare her or make things worse. I just wanted to connect, even if only with a simple hello.
As she walked past my gate, she kept her eyes on the ground. I called out gently, "Good morning, sweetheart." She paused, just for a second. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her eyes looked tired, almost swollen, like she hadn't slept well. When our eyes met, something flickered in hers. Fear, hope, confusion, maybe all at once. I held up the drawing just slightly, enough for her to see it, but not enough for anyone else watching. Her eyes widened, not in surprise, but in recognition. She took a tiny step toward me, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something. Then, the front door snapped open. Her father's voice called her name sharply, making her flinch. She stepped back immediately, almost as if pulled by a string. She turned around without a word and hurried away, her shoulders drawn tight. I lowered the drawing and stepped back inside my house, my heart pounding. That brief moment, her reaction to the drawing, told me more than words ever could. She knew I had found it. She had left it for me on purpose.
I spent the rest of the morning replaying that brief interaction over and over in my mind, my stomach tight with worry, and my thoughts racing faster than I could ever control. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that this drawing wasn't just a random act. It was a call for attention, a silent plea that had somehow reached me. But what could I do? I wasn't a parent. I wasn't a teacher. I wasn't anyone who could officially step into a family's private life. All I had was concern, observation, and a growing sense that time was moving too fast, that every moment I hesitated might make a difference I couldn't undo. I walked from room to room trying to busy myself with cleaning or folding laundry, but my eyes kept wandering to the window, to the house across the street, to the door where the little girl had vanished moments before. I tried to remember my own son at that age, how easily he would have confided in me when something was wrong, how even a small concern could prompt a conversation that cleared up misunderstanding or fear. But children are not always so lucky, and sometimes they find themselves trapped in silence, trapped in situations they don't have the words to explain. By midday, I realized I couldn't wait anymore. I needed to find a way to reach her, even if only to make sure she was okay, even if it was just a brief moment of safety before someone else noticed. I stepped outside, heart pounding, and walked slowly toward the side of the street where she usually played after school. I didn't know what I would say, or even if she would respond, but something inside me insisted that I act rather than wait. Halfway there, I noticed a small piece of paper fluttering in the wind near the curb. I picked it up carefully, my hands trembling slightly, and immediately recognized the uneven scribbles. Another drawing. Her handwriting, her crayon strokes, her unmistakable style. This one was different, though. This time it was just a small figure standing behind a larger, faceless one, a shadowy figure looming over the child, and a series of wavy lines that could have been rain, but they felt more like a wall separating her from the world. The imagery made my chest tighten and my throat dry. It wasn't just a drawing anymore. It was a map of fear, a portrait of her emotional state, a story told in colors and lines that adults often cannot see. I held it close, my mind spinning with questions. Why leave it for me? Why now? Was someone else aware of her fear? I didn't know, but I knew that I had to act carefully. As I walked slowly back toward my house, the girl appeared again. She was standing at the edge of her porch, her small hands clutching the railing, her head tilted as if listening for something she couldn't hear. When our eyes met, I gave her a soft nod, a gesture meant to ensure her that I saw the drawings, that I understood the message, that I wasn't going to ignore her. She nodded back faintly, almost imperceptibly, and retreated inside before her father appeared behind her, his eyes scanning the street as if searching for someone or something. That moment, brief as it was, confirmed everything in my mind. She had been trying to reach out, even in the smallest way, and I was the only one she trusted enough to send a message to. I didn't know what to do next. I couldn't confront the parents directly. It might make things worse. I couldn't call authorities yet. I had no proof beyond the drawings and my observations, and I feared taking action without certainty might put her in greater danger. So I made a quiet decision to keep watching, to gather as much information as possible without alarming anyone. I spent the afternoon near the window, scanning the house, noting every movement, every interaction, every pause. I noticed that the mother seemed tense almost constantly, her eyes darting to the door whenever the father came near. I noticed that the girl sometimes disappeared into the house without anyone else noticing, only to reappear minutes later looking frightened. I noticed that at night, a small light would flicker in the window at irregular hours, not consistent with bedtime,
not consistent with normal routines. The tension I felt began to accumulate into something heavier, pressing against my chest and making it hard to breathe. I realized that this quiet street, this neighborhood that I had believed to be safe, was hiding a story that was both hidden and desperate. And as I held the second drawing in my hand, feeling the waxed ridges and the depressions where the crayon had been pressed too hard, I understood that the little girl had chosen me. Whether she knew why, whether she fully understood her own courage, she had trusted me to see the truth, to hold it, to respond in some way. That realization both scared and emboldened me. I couldn't remain a passive observer anymore. I had to find a way to help her. I just didn't know how yet. By evening, I was exhausted, but my mind refused to rest. I replayed every interaction I had observed, every fleeting sign, every fleeting expression. The drawings, the fleeting glances, the sound I thought I had heard in the night, they were all pieces of a puzzle, and every piece was more urgent than the last. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant bark of a dog, every whisper of wind against the trees outside set my nerves on edge. I felt caught between fear for the girl, uncertainty about what to do, and a responsibility I could not walk away from. By nightfall, I knew the situation had escalated. The drawings were no longer just child play, they were signals, and ignoring them could mean something irreparable. The first thump I had heard weeks ago now echoed in my memory, the small whimpering sounds, the hurried steps of the girl in the morning, all aligning in my mind to create a story that begged for attention. My resolve hardened. I had to find a way to protect her, even if it meant stepping into territory I had never imagined entering. And I knew, deep down, that once I did, nothing about this quiet street would ever be the same again.
The next morning, I woke with a sense of urgency pressing against my chest, a feeling that had grown heavier since the previous night. I couldn't ignore the drawings anymore, and I couldn't let the little girl face whatever was happening alone. I made a slow, deliberate plan in my mind. I would keep a closer watch, and if necessary, I would find a safe way to speak to her without alerting the parents in a way that might worsen her situation. As the sun rose, painting the street with soft light, I saw her stepping out of the house, her backpack hanging limply from her shoulder. I waited until her father left for work and then slowly approached her, keeping my hands visible and my voice gentle. "Hi," I said softly. She looked up, startled for a moment, then cautiously met my gaze. I crouched slightly to be at her level, careful not to seem threatening. "I saw your drawings," I whispered, "and I want to help if I can." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of relief passing over her features before fear returned. She opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated, then shook her head almost imperceptibly. I understood. She was testing if she could trust me, if it was safe. That brief moment of recognition confirmed my suspicions. Her parents were not providing the comfort and safety she needed, at least not in the way she required. Over the next several days, I observed more patterns. The father was strict, silent, often appearing tense, his eyes darting as if expecting trouble at every turn. The mother seemed withdrawn, distracted, sometimes angry, and occasionally harsh with the girl over minor mistakes or missteps. I noted every interaction, trying to piece together what I could from behavior alone. One evening, I saw the girl leaving her room after dinner, holding a small object in her hand. She paused at the door, glancing out the window toward my house, as if asking herself whether she could take the risk. She did, eventually. She slipped outside and walked slowly toward my gate, clutching what appeared to be another drawing. I met her eyes and gave a small nod of encouragement. She handed me the paper with trembling hands, her lips barely moving as she whispered, "Please." I felt my heart ache. This was more than a drawing now. It was a plea, a message that she could not speak aloud, but had chosen to entrust to me. I set the paper down carefully and knelt beside her. "I'll help," I said, keeping my voice calm and warm. "I promise, I'll help." For a brief moment, her shoulders relaxed, a small spark of trust forming between us. That night, I examined the drawing more closely. It depicted her alone in a room, shadows stretching across the walls and figures looming in ways that made my chest tighten. It wasn't just fear on paper.
It was a map of isolation and danger. My mind raced. How long had this been happening? How many nights had she spent quietly scared, waiting for someone to notice? How many drawings had gone unseen, unnoticed, unheeded? I realized that this situation was more complex than I had imagined. I couldn't simply intervene without strategy. I needed to understand more, to gather proof if necessary, and to ensure that any steps I took would not endanger her further. The following days were tense. I kept close observation, watching for signs of escalation. Sometimes the girl seemed hopeful, smiling faintly as she passed my window. Other times she flinched at the smallest sound, retreating into herself. The parents' behavior was unpredictable. Some moments suggested normalcy, but in others, small acts of control, fear, or neglect were evident. I recorded these observations silently in my mind, preparing for a time when intervention would be unavoidable. During one particularly quiet afternoon, I overheard a sharp exchange through the thin walls of the street. The mother's voice was hushed but urgent, the father's calm but intimidating. I couldn't hear the details, but the tension was undeniable. The little girl sat on the steps, clutching her knees, not daring to move or speak. That sight lingered in my mind, filling me with a sense of urgency I couldn't ignore. I thought about reaching out to neighbors, friends, or even authorities, but I hesitated. I needed certainty, not assumptions. I needed to be prepared before taking action. The pressure built each day, each observation compounding on the previous until it became almost unbearable. My own life, once peaceful and predictable, was consumed with thoughts of how to help her, how to ensure her safety, and how to act without making the situation worse. I knew that the longer I waited, the greater the risk became. Each drawing, each fearful glance, each sign of distress was a ticking clock, counting down toward an unknown but inevitable breaking point. I could feel it. And yet I had to be patient. I had to be careful. I had to act with precision, with empathy, and with courage, even though my heart raced every time she stepped outside, even though I felt helpless in ways I had never imagined. The street that had once seemed so calm, so ordinary, now carried the weight of hidden pain. Every small movement across the way was a reminder of the story unfolding behind closed doors, a story I had been drawn into whether I wanted to or not. And I realized, more acutely than ever, that the rising conflict was no longer something I could observe from a distance.
It had arrived at my doorstep in the form of the little girl's drawings, her fearful glances, and the quiet but constant tension radiating from the house next door. The tension reached a point where every sound, every shadow, every flicker of light across the street made my heart pound as though it were trying to escape my chest. I began leaving small notes for her, careful messages tucked under the door, gentle words of reassurance, letting her know that someone outside the house saw her and cared, that she was not entirely alone. Each note brought a small spark of courage to her eyes when she read them, a flicker of recognition that she could reach out safely, even if only in secret. Yet the danger remained constant, silent but palpable. I started keeping a journal of every drawing, every observation, every subtle shift in behavior, trying to make sense of patterns that seemed only to grow more urgent with each passing day. I saw her father shout once over a minor accident, a sound sharp enough to make my chest tighten and my stomach churn. But the girl had stayed silent, lowering her eyes and shrinking in on herself as if that would make him stop. The mother, meanwhile, seemed exhausted and distant, her presence more like a shadow than a guiding hand. And it became clear to me that the household was a place where fear had settled comfortably in the corners, a constant companion for the little girl. Night after night, I heard the quiet sounds of movement in their home, doors creaking, soft footsteps, occasional whimpers, and I began keeping track, timing them, hoping to understand the rhythm of their nights and the pattern of control and fear. The drawings continued to appear at my door, each one darker than the last, each one more desperate, depicting figures looming, walls closing in, and small figures trapped. I realized that this child was trying to communicate something I had no right to fully understand, yet I could not ignore. I began weighing my options, considering carefully when and how to intervene without making the situation worse. I even walked past the house at different times,
pretending to tend to my garden or pick up the newspaper, observing discreetly, trying to gauge the parents' moods and the little girl's reactions, always careful not to be noticed, always careful to protect her anonymity. One evening, I caught a glimpse of her peeking through the curtains, her small face pressed against the glass, eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. I waved softly, and she hesitated before nodding just slightly. That small gesture sent a wave of relief and worry at once through me. I knew she was waiting for help but didn't know how to ask for it outright, and I also knew that any wrong move on my part could make her situation worse. Over time, I began to notice a pattern in the parents' behavior. The father's presence was intimidating, his temper restrained but easily triggered. The mother's interactions were inconsistent, occasionally gentle, often sharp, leaving the girl unsure of where she stood. The atmosphere of the house itself seemed oppressive, every small sound magnified, every glance or raised voice leaving ripples of fear. And the little girl's drawings were windows into her reality, each one a snapshot of her growing anxiety, her isolation, and her need for someone to see her truth. My anxiety and responsibility grew alongside her fear. I began to feel a constant pressure, a heaviness in my chest that was impossible to shake. I couldn't eat properly. I couldn't rest fully. Every knock of the wind against my windows felt like a warning, every passing neighbor's glance a reminder that I was alone in noticing the truth. I debated contacting authorities, worried that doing so without proper evidence could escalate the danger. I thought about reaching out to neighbors, but I couldn't be sure they would act wisely or safely. So I resolved to observe, to document, and to prepare for the moment when I could intervene in a way that would truly help her. Each passing day added layers of tension, the conflict rising steadily like water approaching a flood. Every morning, every walk, every glance out my window reminded me that this situation was fragile, urgent, and beyond anything I had anticipated facing in my quiet life. The drawings, the glances, the small interactions, they were all signs of a child navigating danger the only way she knew how, reaching out to someone she trusted, and I had been chosen to be that someone. The responsibility weighed heavily, a constant presence in every thought and every heartbeat as the rising conflict of observation, fear, and the need for action consumed the quiet rhythm of my days. The situation was no longer just a quiet worry. It was now an urgent growing storm, one that demanded action, one that I knew would reach a point of confrontation, revelation, or heartbreak, and I felt the inevitable approaching like a shadow stretching across the street, drawing me further into the life and fear of the little girl whose drawings had found their way to me.
The day it finally happened, I woke with a sense of unease that clung to me like a heavy fog, pressing down on my chest before I even opened my eyes, and I knew instinctively that nothing would be ordinary anymore. From the moment I looked out the window and saw the little girl stepping outside with her backpack hung loosely, her small hands clutching another drawing, my pulse quickened. She paused briefly at the edge of the porch, scanning the street as if weighing the risk of being seen, and for a fleeting second our eyes met, and I saw in hers a silent urgency that made every nerve in my body stand on end. I opened the door slowly, trying to appear calm and unthreatening, and motioned for her to come a little closer. She took a hesitant step forward, clutching the paper to her chest, her tiny fingers trembling, and I could see the weight of fear she carried pressed into her posture, the way she hunched slightly, trying to make herself smaller, almost invisible. "I'm here," I whispered, kneeling slightly so I could be nearer to her level without seeming imposing. She nodded faintly, eyes wide, and handed me the drawing. I glanced at it quickly. It was different this time, more desperate, more detailed. Shadows pressed into corners of the paper, figures looming larger, and the little girl herself depicted trapped behind walls that stretched too high to climb. A storm seemed to hover in the sky above her drawn world, black clouds thick and heavy. And at the edge of the drawing, scribbled almost illegibly in a shaky hand, were words. "Help me. Please." My stomach tightened, and my throat went dry. I understood clearly now, this wasn't just a sign, this wasn't just a warning, this was an urgent cry for help, a desperate communication from someone who felt trapped and alone. I scanned the street quickly, making sure no one was approaching, but the houses around were quiet, the wind still, the morning light soft yet deceptive, masking the danger that existed within the walls across from me. I realized I had to act, and yet every part of me hesitated, paralyzed by the enormity of what stepping in might mean. What if I misread something?
What if intervening brought consequences worse than what she was already enduring? But before fear could root me to the spot, she took a tiny step closer, lifting her face to mine with eyes that begged silently for help. I inhaled, steadying my shaking hands, and told her softly, "I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." She nodded again, a flicker of relief passing over her features, before fear immediately returned as her father's voice echoed from inside the house, calling her name sharply. Her shoulders stiffened, and she shrank back toward the porch, glancing at me as if torn between trust and obedience. I watched, helpless, as she retreated inside under his watchful gaze, the door shutting behind her with a finality that echoed through the empty street. That moment struck me harder than I expected. The stark contrast between the small act of reaching out and the immediate silencing made my heart pound and my mind race. It was then I knew the situation had escalated beyond quiet observation. It demanded action. I spent the rest of the morning pacing, planning, trying to anticipate every possible reaction, every scenario, every way this fragile trust could be broken. When I saw the father leave later for work, I moved quickly, retrieving the drawing she had left behind near my gate, and began considering all avenues to ensure her safety without exposing her unnecessarily. My thoughts churned constantly, weighing every choice, every word, every potential consequence. The drawings, the glances, the whispered pleas, they were all pieces of a story that I had been pulled into against my will, yet could no longer ignore. I walked slowly past her house, pretending to tend to my own garden, trying to catch sight of her without alarming anyone. She peeked through the curtains briefly, eyes wide, then ducked back out of sight, and I could sense her recognition of my presence, her silent acknowledgement that I had understood. That tiny interaction reinforced everything I already suspected. She had chosen me to see the truth, and she was waiting, quietly, desperately, for someone to act. The day stretched on with unbearable tension. I could hear movements from inside the house, the shifting of furniture, muted voices, a faint sob that broke my heart, and I realized the full weight of what this child had endured in silence. Every small sound magnified in my awareness, every shadow cast by passing clouds or tree branches became part of the narrative I was piecing together. I tried to steady myself, telling myself that patience was necessary, that rushing could ruin any chance of helping her safely. But the anxiety was relentless, gnawing at me, a constant drum in my chest, and the drawings in my hand seemed heavier with each passing hour. By late afternoon, I noticed her slipping out again, this time carrying a small object in her hand, something she wanted me to see, something she trusted me with. I waited until her father was distracted, then motioned for her to come closer. She obeyed cautiously, stepping lightly, eyes scanning constantly. I knelt and accepted what she had brought. A small notebook, its pages filled with sketches and words that told the story of fear, isolation, and small secret hopes. Reading through it, my heart broke further with each page, each scribbled word, each tiny drawing that depicted nights filled with worry, days filled with quiet tension, and moments of hope that flickered and died too quickly. I realized in that moment that the situation was more than I could manage alone. It was a breaking point not just for her but for me. I had been observing for weeks, gathering evidence silently in my mind, weighing consequences, fearing repercussions, yet now I could no longer remain a bystander. The turning point had arrived. Action was unavoidable. That evening, I made the decision to contact someone I could trust, someone who could intervene safely and effectively. But before I did, the little girl came to my door again, hands trembling, eyes wide with urgency, carrying another drawing. She pressed it into my hands and whispered, "Please don't let them know." Her plea, soft and fearful, cemented in my mind the truth I could no longer ignore. This was no longer about quiet observation or gentle concern. This was about stepping into a world of danger, fear, and secrecy that demanded courage and careful strategy. The pieces were aligned, the signals unmistakable, and my role clear. I had to act. And the weight of responsibility settled heavily over me, a crushing mixture of fear, empathy, and determination that I would carry with me from that moment onward.
Once I had the notebook in my hands, I studied every page with painstaking attention, noting patterns, times, and small details that revealed the rhythms of her fear. Some pages showed her alone in her room with shadows stretching across the walls. Others depicted her parents in ways that were distorted, faceless, or looming, their presence more threatening than comforting. The more I looked,
the more I realized that these drawings were not random. They were a careful record of her reality, a desperate attempt to communicate something no one else had noticed. I felt my chest tighten and my stomach twist with urgency. It was clear now that waiting or hesitating was no longer an option. I had been a silent witness for too long, and the time to act had arrived. I couldn't confront the parents directly. It would be too risky, too volatile. I couldn't simply take the girl away or involve strangers without a plan. I needed to proceed with caution, but I also needed to move quickly before the fragile trust we had established was broken. That evening, I arranged a meeting with someone I knew could intervene safely, a child protection worker I had once met at a local community event. I prepared carefully, taking the notebook and the drawings as evidence, explaining the patterns I had observed and the subtle signs I had witnessed over weeks. Every detail mattered: the fleeting glances, the whispered pleas, the objects she left at my doorstep, and the way she interacted with her parents. The worker listened intently, asking questions, making notes, and occasionally pausing to reflect. By the end of the meeting, we had a plan to approach the situation delicately, prioritizing the girl's safety while ensuring that no action would escalate the danger she faced at home. That night, after the meeting, I returned home with a renewed sense of purpose and an undercurrent of dread. I knew the next steps could be risky, and the girl's trust in me was fragile and precious. I had to protect it as fiercely as I protected her physical safety. As I prepared for the following day, I felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on me. Each sound outside, each passing car, each distant footstep reminded me that the street was still quiet to everyone else, but for me, it was alive with tension and urgency. The next morning, I watched from my window as the girl moved through her morning routine, careful, almost mechanical, glancing toward my house and then quickly away. When she noticed me observing, her small hand lifted slightly in acknowledgement, a subtle nod that told me that she was aware of the plan forming to protect her. I breathed a quiet sigh of relief but remained vigilant. By mid-morning, the father left for work and the mother appeared distracted with chores. It was a small window, but it was enough. I approached the girl's gate carefully, notebook in hand, and whispered, "We need to talk. Can you step outside?" Her eyes widened and she looked toward the door nervously, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. Then slowly she stepped out, clutching the latest drawing to her chest. I guided her to a small spot out of sight from the street, crouching to her level and speaking softly. "Everything you've shown me, I understand. I want to help, but we need to be careful." Her small shoulders shook as she nodded and tears pooled in her eyes. "I'm scared," she whispered. My heart ached at the words. "I know," I said gently. "That's why we have a plan. You're not alone anymore." Together we walked to a nearby spot where she felt safe, and I handed her the notebook. "This is important. We're going to use this to make sure you're safe," I explained. She nodded again, burying her face against her hands briefly, then looked up with hesitant trust. It was in that moment that the full reality hit me. The turning point was no longer just about my decision or her courage. It was about the intersection of trust, timing, and action. Every choice from this moment forward could define the rest of her childhood and possibly the rest of my life. That day, small actions became monumental. Each careful word, each glance, each step was laden with the weight of responsibility. I had to maintain her trust while preparing for intervention. I couldn't afford missteps, panic, or hesitation, and I couldn't ignore the urgency pulsating from the notebook, from the drawings, from her eyes, each a silent cry demanding more than passive observation. Hours passed as we coordinated with the child protection worker, establishing signals, safe spaces, and contingency plans. By evening, a sense of cautious hope, mixed with fear, settled over me. We were on the brink of action, standing at the threshold between prolonged silent suffering and a chance at safety. The little girl, exhausted but relieved, returned to her home briefly, understanding the risks, understanding the need for secrecy, and yet showing in her eyes a spark of trust that anchored me. That night, I barely slept, reviewing every detail in my mind, preparing for the next day, knowing that the turning point, the moment where observation becomes intervention, where fear must meet courage, was imminent and irreversible.
The following morning felt heavier than any I had experienced before, as though the air itself carried the tension I had been silently storing for weeks. I woke early, every sound amplified, the wind brushing the trees, the distant hum of cars, the faint creak of floorboards from the house next door, and my mind raced through every scenario, every possibility, every consequence of what was about to happen. I knew that today we had to act, that the time for careful observation had ended, and that the delicate balance between trust and safety now depended on precision, empathy, and courage. As I prepared, I went over each signal we had agreed upon, the small nods, the moments when she would step out quietly, the spots we had identified as safe, the means to keep her hidden while we confirmed the next steps with the authorities. My stomach twisted in knots with the weight of responsibility, knowing that one wrong move could shatter the fragile trust she had placed in me, or worse, escalate her danger.
When the little girl emerged again, her eyes wide but determined, clutching her backpack, I motioned subtly for her to follow my path, keeping to shaded areas, avoiding the line of sight from the house. Each step was deliberate, careful, measured. I whispered gently, "We're going to do this carefully. Just follow me and stay calm." Her small nod reassured me that she understood, that she had made the decision to trust me fully in this moment. We moved slowly down the street, the weight of each step pressing against the urgency I felt. Every creak of the sidewalk, every distant sound sent a jolt of panic through me, yet I maintained a steady voice, a calm presence, knowing she needed reassurance more than anything else. As we reached the first safe point, a small alcove shielded from view, I crouched beside her and looked at her intently. "I know it's scary," I said softly, "but you've been brave already. You've told me things in the only way you could, and now we're going to make sure you're safe." Her lips trembled and she nodded, but I could see the fear lingering, the constant awareness of danger etched into her posture, into the way she held herself small and cautious. I took the notebook and drawings carefully from her, holding them in my hands as if they were sacred artifacts, records of her struggle, evidence of the world she could not otherwise voice. I began coordinating quietly with the child protection worker by phone, explaining our position, the exact location, the timings and the steps we had taken to keep her safe while awaiting professional guidance. Minutes felt like hours as we crouched together, hidden from view, listening to the distant sounds of life inside the house next door. Each muffled footstep, each creak of the front door made my heart pound, reminding me that danger was real, constant, and unpredictable. Finally, a car approached, and I recognized it as the child protection worker arriving, careful to park out of immediate sight. I motioned subtly to the girl, whispering, "They're here. You're safe now. Just follow my lead." Her eyes widened with a mixture of fear and relief, and she held my hand tightly as we approached the parked car cautiously, staying out of view from the house. The worker greeted her gently, using soft words and a warm voice, allowing the girl to ease into a sense of safety while maintaining discretion. I stayed close, offering physical reassurance, a hand on her shoulder, a gentle squeeze, to let her know she wasn't alone, that someone had come to protect her. The tension that had been building for weeks began to release slightly, though every sense in my body remained heightened. We walked carefully back toward the vehicle, mindful of the windows of the house, the possibility of someone noticing, the fragility of the moment. The worker assessed the situation quickly, asking the child simple, non-threatening questions and noting her responses, while I maintained a presence that balanced calmness with alertness. In that moment, I realized the gravity of the turning point. Weeks of observation, fear, and silent preparation had culminated in this precise intersection of courage, timing, and trust. If any part of this failed, it could undo everything. But the girl's bravery and our careful planning made the difference. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of quiet, careful movement, she was safely in the vehicle, her small face pale but relieved. I watched as the worker reassured her, promising protection, care, and a safe place. And I felt a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and lingering fear for what would come next. It was the moment I had been preparing for, the culmination of tension, the apex of rising conflict, and the point at which I realized the full weight of responsibility I had carried and the courage the little girl had shown by trusting a stranger with her life through small drawings and secret messages. The turning point was complete, yet it left me raw, my heart pounding, my mind replaying every small detail, and a deep awareness of how fragile safety and trust can be in the world of children who suffer silently. Even after she was safely in the vehicle, I remained crouched nearby, heart still racing, watching the house across the street as though expecting something else to happen, some last-minute threat, some unforeseen danger. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying ordinary neighborhood sounds that somehow felt sinister after weeks of heightened tension, and I realized how long I had been living with the weight of this secret, the responsibility of another human life pressed on my shoulders. The child protection worker drove slowly, keeping the girl hidden from view, while I walked back to my house, my legs trembling, my mind replaying every drawing, every subtle glance, every muffled cry I had observed. The silence of my own home felt overwhelming, filled with the echoes of what I had witnessed and what I had just participated in, and I knew that nothing in this quiet street would ever feel ordinary again. I sank into a chair, the notebook and drawings resting on the table beside me, and allowed myself a moment to breathe, though the adrenaline still pulsed through my veins. Questions tumbled through my mind. Would she be okay now? Would the authorities follow through carefully? Had I done everything correctly? Could I have acted sooner? And yet, despite the lingering fear, I felt a deep sense of relief that I had finally acted, that the turning point, the moment when observation became intervention, had occurred. I thought about the little girl, her tiny hands clutching the drawings, her fearful expressions, and the quiet intensity of the turning point that had reshaped both our lives. I realized that turning points often come not with dramatic confrontations, but with precise, deliberate, and empathetic action at the exact right moment. The notebook and drawings remained on the table, tangible evidence of a world of fear, isolation, and resilience that few would ever see or understand. I traced the crayon lines with my fingers, feeling the weight of each mark, each scribbled word, each shadow she had drawn, and I silently promised that I would never forget, that I would carry this experience with me, that it would change the way I saw vulnerability, trust, and courage forever. That night, sleep finally found me, but my dreams were not peaceful. They were filled with her drawings, her fearful expressions, and the quiet intensity of the turning point that had reshaped both our lives. And as I drifted in and out of rest, I knew that the real work, the process of healing, of protection, and of understanding was just beginning, that the story had reached its pivot, but the aftermath would demand patience, empathy, and a calm strength that would carry me into the resolution that was yet to come. The turning point had arrived, and with it a profound awareness that life often requires intervention in small, precise, and courageous ways, that children can communicate truths adults often miss, and that sometimes the line between helpless observer and active protector is drawn by a single choice, a single act of trust, and the courage to step into the unknown.
In the days that followed the turning point, a quiet sense of relief mingled with lingering tension, as though the air itself had shifted but still carried echoes of fear. The little girl had been placed in a safe environment under the care of trained professionals, and though I knew she was protected physically, my mind could not escape the emotional aftermath, the weight of what she had endured, and the impact of the weeks of silent observation and intervention. I visited occasionally, each time walking carefully, quietly, ensuring that her trust remained intact, that her fragile sense of safety was not disrupted by sudden actions or overwhelming attention. I could see changes slowly emerging in her demeanor. The tense, withdrawn posture softened, and the small glances of fear that had haunted her eyes began to give way to cautious curiosity, a tentative sense that the world could be a safe place if approached carefully. She still drew, still sketched shadows and quiet corners of her mind, but the images now included brighter spaces, small figures smiling or reaching for each other, and scenes of warmth alongside the darker ones that had once dominated her notebooks. I found myself spending hours reviewing these drawings, understanding her inner world, the way she was processing trauma, and the slow emergence of hope that came with safety and consistent care. The child protection worker and her caregivers coordinated with me to maintain continuity, and I realized the importance of empathy and patience in every interaction, every gentle question, every small acknowledgement of her experiences. Over time, I saw that the little girl's voice began to return, soft at first, hesitant, then gradually more confident, as she learned that speaking out could be safe, that expressing herself could be heard without judgment or punishment. I also began reflecting deeply on my own role, the burden I had carried, and the courage it had taken to act when I had felt fear and uncertainty.
it became clear that resolution was not about a single heroic act or a dramatic confrontation. It was about consistent presence, gentle support, and unwavering attention to the signals of someone who could not speak loudly for themselves. I would sit with her in quiet spaces, allowing her to show me her drawings, asking about the small details, and letting her lead the conversation in her own time, understanding that healing was measured in moments, not hours. Each day brought incremental progress, a small smile, a quiet laugh, a willingness to speak her thoughts, and I felt the tension from the turning point begin to soften, replaced by a gentle hope that had been impossible weeks before. I also began noticing the subtle changes in myself, how vigilance and empathy had sharpened my perception of the world, how patience had deepened my understanding of fear and courage, and how witnessing resilience in such a fragile form had left an indelible mark on my heart. I kept track of every progress, every nuance, aware that the journey from fear to trust, from silence to voice, was gradual and needed constant nurturing. Occasionally, I reflected on the parents, understanding that their role had been part of the complex dynamic, and that accountability, intervention, and compassion had to be balanced carefully to prevent further harm. The neighborhood, once so ordinary and predictable, now felt layered with meaning, as if every small sound, every closed curtain, every child's glance carried weight I had never considered before. I found myself walking the street with a heightened awareness, noticing details previously ignored, understanding the hidden stories behind the simplest gestures. The little girl's laughter, though still tentative, became a source of light, a reminder of the resilience that could emerge from the darkest experiences, and each smile etched a quiet sense of fulfillment deep in my chest. I also began sharing my experience carefully with trusted individuals, advocating for the importance of noticing subtle signs, understanding children's silent pleas, and acting with empathy and responsibility without exposing those who are vulnerable to greater danger. The notebook and drawings remained with me as reminders, each one a testament to courage, survival, and the delicate balance between fear and hope. I realized that resolution was not about erasing trauma, but about creating spaces where trust, care, and safety could flourish, where a child could reclaim small pieces of a world once overshadowed by fear. Nights became calmer, my own heart less burdened, and yet I never forgot the weeks of silent observation, the tension, the small signals, and the fear that had pressed relentlessly against my chest. Each resolved moment, each step toward healing, reminded me that courage is not always loud, that action does not always roar, and that the quiet decisions made in the face of fear can be the most profound. The turning point had set the stage, but resolution unfolded slowly, patiently, gently, like dawn breaking after a long night of darkness, and I realized that witnessing, supporting, and nurturing was as powerful as any dramatic intervention. The little girl, once trapped in fear and shadows, began to walk with more confidence, speak with a clearer voice, and allow trust to grow, each day a small triumph, each gesture a step toward reclaiming the childhood stolen by silence and uncertainty. My own reflection became clearer as well. I saw the power of empathy, the necessity of courage, and the quiet strength of sustained attention to the needs of those who cannot fully articulate their pain. As the days turned into weeks, I witnessed more subtle yet profound changes in her behavior and expressions, each small gesture a sign that she was beginning to feel a sense of safety that had been absent for too long. Her drawings gradually shifted. The sharp, jagged lines that once dominated her pages softened into curves. The dark, looming figures were replaced with images of light, warmth, and quiet companionship. Occasionally, she would draw the house next door, but now it appeared smaller, less intimidating, and in some images she herself stood outside the windows, smiling and reaching toward the sky. These drawings became a language of hope, a visual representation of her growing resilience, and I realized that even the smallest expressions could signify profound progress. I spent hours with her, gently discussing her art, asking what each detail meant, encouraging her to articulate feelings she had previously hidden, and celebrating every step she took toward trust and self-expression. Slowly, our conversations expanded from drawings to small stories, to brief descriptions of her days, and eventually to her dreams for the future. It was remarkable to witness the gradual transformation from fear and silence to tentative confidence, and I felt honored to be a part of this delicate process. I also observed that she began to engage more with her caregivers, testing boundaries in safe ways, expressing discomfort when something felt wrong, and seeking reassurance when needed. These behaviors, though subtle, were profound indicators of the restoration of her sense of agency, of reclaiming control over her own life, however incrementally. During this period, I kept in regular contact with the child protection worker, discussing progress, challenges, and next steps, and I realized how crucial a coordinated, patient, and empathetic approach was in ensuring that trauma did not resurface or intensify. Every day brought small victories, a quiet laugh shared in confidence, a hesitant glance of curiosity toward others, the willingness to try new activities, and each of these moments reinforced the importance of vigilance, support, and gentle encouragement. I also reflected on my own emotions throughout this process, acknowledging the mixture of relief, exhaustion, lingering fear, and deep satisfaction that came with seeing her gradually recover from experiences that had once held her in silent captivity. In my own home, I noticed changes in my perspective, how ordinary moments, like the sound of children playing, the rustle of leaves, or a neighbor's casual greeting, held layers of meaning and reflection. The experience had taught me to observe carefully, to empathize profoundly, and to recognize the often invisible struggles that exist even in familiar, seemingly peaceful environments. Nights once filled with worry and tension became more peaceful, though I remained attuned to the subtle signals of concern, always mindful that progress was delicate and could be disrupted if vigilance lapsed. The little girl's growing confidence was matched by her curiosity, her questions about the world becoming more frequent, her willingness to engage with new experiences evident in small, joyful gestures. Each milestone, however minor it might seem to an outsider, represented significant emotional growth and resilience, and I documented these moments with quiet reverence, understanding that healing is incremental, fragile, and profoundly meaningful. I realized that resolution was not about erasing trauma, but about creating spaces where trust, care, and safety could flourish, where a child could reclaim small pieces of a world once overshadowed by fear. As the weeks passed, the dark shadow that had once loomed over her life dissipated gradually, replaced by the gentle glow of safety, trust, and connection, and I recognized that resolution, in its truest sense, is a process, a steady unfolding of healing, reassurance, and sustained support that allows the injured heart to regain its rhythm and the frightened spirit to find its voice.
As I continued to support her, I began noticing subtler signs of her growing strength. Small gestures that once would have gone unnoticed now carried profound significance. She began to sleep more soundly, no longer starting awake at the faintest noise, and her small routines began to reflect a sense of safety she had previously never experienced. I observed her interactions with caregivers and peers, noting the gradual confidence in her voice, the curiosity in her eyes, and the tentative smiles that slowly replaced the anxious frowns of the past. Each new step she took, however minor, became a testament to the resilience that had been nurtured through patience, attention, and gentle guidance. The drawings she continued to make served as both a creative outlet and a bridge of communication, revealing her internal processing, her hopes, her lingering fears, and her growing trust. I encouraged her to explore colors beyond dark shades, to add elements of light, warmth, and life to her sketches, and I celebrated every addition as a victory, a signal that her inner world was expanding beyond the shadows that had once confined it. Slowly, she began to articulate memories and feelings that had been previously locked away, sharing fragments of experience in her own way, at her own pace, always with the reassurance that she would be heard and believed. I marveled at the courage required for such small disclosures, understanding that every word spoken was a reclaiming of agency, a subtle yet profound assertion of self in a world that had once felt unsafe. Our conversations evolved gradually, flowing from observations about the drawings to questions about school, friends, and personal interests, and I was careful to maintain a tone of encouragement without pushing too quickly, allowing trust to grow organically. I noticed a slow but unmistakable shift in her demeanor, the way she carried herself, the way she engaged with me, and the gentle curiosity with which she now viewed her surroundings were all signs of an emerging confidence that had been buried beneath fear for so long. Over time, I began coordinating more actively with the caregivers, providing insights into her evolving needs, sharing observations about triggers, preferences, and behaviors that reflected her inner growth, and helping to shape an environment where her emotional recovery could flourish. Each small step forward, each expression of curiosity or joy,
Each tentative smile became a milestone in a healing process that was painstakingly incremental, yet incredibly profound. I realized that the resolution we were experiencing was less about dramatic revelations and more about the accumulation of small, steady moments of safety, understanding, and empowerment, moments that collectively transformed fear into trust, silence into voice, and isolation into connection. I also reflected on my own emotional journey throughout this period, the way tension, anxiety, and fear had once dominated my thoughts, the responsibility I had felt, and the simultaneous sense of hope and dread that had accompanied every decision. These reflections deepened my appreciation for the delicate interplay of courage, empathy, and patience that underpin true resolution, reminding me that interventions, no matter how carefully planned, are only as effective as the ongoing support, vigilance, and understanding that follow. Nights gradually became less fraught with worry. The stillness of the street no longer amplified fear, but allowed for reflection on the progress that had been made, on the quiet victories that often go unnoticed, and on the resilience of a child who had been willing to trust a stranger in the midst of danger. Each drawing, each whispered conversation, each moment of laughter became evidence of recovery and a symbol of the profound impact that attentive, empathetic intervention can have. I began documenting these moments, not for recognition or proof, but as a reminder of the fragile and powerful nature of human courage and the transformative effect of trust, patience, and protection. The little girl's emerging confidence was mirrored in her willingness to explore her environment, engage with peers, and express herself creatively. And I realized that resolution was not a destination, but a continuous process, a living, evolving series of steps toward healing, empowerment, and self-assurance. With every passing day, the shadows that had once dominated her world receded, replaced by glimpses of light, laughter, and hope, each moment a testament to resilience, empathy, and the enduring impact of deliberate, compassionate action. By the time several months had passed, the transformation in the little girl was remarkable, subtle yet unmistakable, as if each day had added a new layer of confidence, security, and joy that had been absent before. She moved through her routines with a sense of ease I had never seen, her laughter more frequent, her curiosity more vivid, and her small gestures full of self-assurance and trust. The drawings she continued to create now reflected a rich, imaginative world that included friends, sunlight, open spaces, and scenes of warmth and comfort, demonstrating how far her emotional recovery had come. I often marveled at the courage she had shown, the quiet bravery in trusting me, the patience in waiting for help to arrive, and the resilience that allowed her to rebuild her sense of safety step by step. I also noticed the subtle ways in which her trust extended to others, caregivers, peers, and even neighbors, indicating that the foundation of safety we had carefully nurtured was spreading outward into her interactions with the wider world. In my own reflection, I felt the lingering impact of the weeks of fear, observation, and intervention, the anxiety, the sleepless nights, the relentless focus on her signals, and the quiet determination that had guided my actions. Yet alongside that weight, there was a profound sense of fulfillment, a recognition that deliberate, compassionate attention could reshape a life, and that patience, empathy, and vigilance were instruments of healing as powerful as any dramatic act. Resolution, I realized, was not a single moment of triumph, but an ongoing process of creating spaces where trust could grow, where fear could dissipate, and where a child's voice could emerge safely and confidently. Each day became a reaffirmation of what we had achieved, small victories, incremental growth, and the quiet, persistent work of nurturing emotional resilience. I spent hours reflecting on the journey, acknowledging that the turning point, the moment of decisive action, had set in motion a chain of events that demanded continued care, mindfulness, and presence. I also recognized the profound interconnectedness of trust, courage, and intervention, understanding that the little girl's ability to thrive depended not only on professional care, but on the consistent reinforcement of safety, empathy, and support. As I observed her engaging with her surroundings, making friends, exploring interests, and expressing herself creatively, I felt a quiet warmth and a sense of hope that had been impossible to imagine in the weeks of fear and observation. The notebook and drawings remained a symbol of her journey, tangible reminders of the darkness she had endured, the bravery she had shown and the steps she had taken toward reclaiming her life. Nights became calm, filled not with worry, but with reflection and gratitude, as I considered how delicate yet powerful human resilience can be when met with patient, empathetic care. Resolution, in its truest form, had arrived, a blend of safety, trust, understanding, and the ongoing work of nurturing growth and confidence in someone who had once felt invisible, unheard, and alone. And as I sat quietly, watching the little girl laugh, draw, and explore her world with renewed freedom, I understood that the deepest kind of resolution is not an ending, but a living, breathing process of care, protection, and empowerment that transforms fear into trust, silence into voice, and vulnerability into resilience, leaving a lasting imprint on both the healed and those who bore witness to that journey of courage and trust.
In the weeks that followed the resolution, I began to notice a quiet transformation not only in the little girl, but in myself, a subtle shift that made ordinary moments feel heavier with meaning and lighter with hope at the same time. The street, once just a place I walked every day, now felt alive with layers I had never perceived before. The laughter of children, the conversations of neighbors, the subtle movements that spoke of life going on, and yet beneath it all, a sense of awareness that darkness could be hidden behind the most ordinary doors. I thought often about the girl, her courage, the drawing she had left at my doorstep, the silent pleas that had guided me toward action, and I realized that even the smallest gestures can carry enormous weight when they are acts of communication from someone who cannot speak openly. Each day, as she moved through her life with growing confidence, I felt a mixture of relief and awe. Relief that she was safe, that her resilience was blooming, and awe at the human capacity to endure, to survive, and to trust again, even after profound fear. I reflected on the weeks leading up to the turning point, the observation, the growing fear, the late-night pacing, the whispered pleas, and the careful coordination with the child protection worker, and I recognized that every moment had contributed to the eventual safety, healing, and empowerment that now flourished. At times, I wondered how many other children might be in quiet danger, hidden behind closed doors and closed curtains, and it reminded me of the importance of vigilance, empathy, and courage in small, careful actions. I thought about the parents, too, about the complexities of accountability and the need for intervention that is measured, protective, and ultimately humane, recognizing that real-world solutions rarely come in the form of simple black-and-white answers, but rather through persistent attention, compassion, and careful decision-making. The little girl's growth became my guide. Her laughter, tentative at first and gradually more confident, reminded me of the power of nurturing, of listening, and of responding to the unspoken needs of those who depend on others for safety. Each day I marveled at her imagination as it expanded, how her drawings now included playful interactions, sunlight, open spaces, and scenes of joy, a stark contrast to the shadows and fear that had once dominated her pages. Through this, I realized that the journey toward healing is never linear, never instantaneous. It is a patient unfolding, a daily investment of attention, care, and presence that allows someone who has been hurt to reclaim their life one step at a time. My own perspective on life had changed as well. The ordinary had become extraordinary. Every small moment of trust and courage felt monumental, and I saw that the world was filled with silent stories waiting for someone to notice, to intervene gently and to respond with care. Nights grew quieter, calmer, but they also held a new awareness of the fragility and resilience of life, and I found myself reflecting often on the interplay of fear and hope, vulnerability and courage, silence and voice. The girl's progress became a source of quiet inspiration. The slow return of confidence in her eyes, the small smiles, the tentative gestures toward others, and the willingness to express herself creatively all reminded me that transformation is possible even after trauma, and that consistent care, empathy, and trust are the instruments of that transformation. I also began documenting the story in my own way, not for recognition, but as a reminder that vigilance and empathy can change lives, that the ordinary observer can become an active protector, and that moments of courage, however quiet, ripple outward in ways we often cannot predict. In the soft morning light, watching her interact with the world, I felt the profound lesson of the experience settle within me, that trust is sacred, that fear can be overcome with careful attention and care, and that human resilience is both astonishing and fragile, deserving of protection, encouragement, and love. Even as the street returned to its usual rhythm, the ordinary patterns of daily life,
I carried the memory of her courage, the notebook and drawings and the weeks of tension and action, as a reminder that ordinary places may hide extraordinary stories, and ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they listen, notice, and act with empathy. I reflected often on my own role, the fear and hesitation I had felt before stepping forward, the small acts of courage I had taken, and the awareness that sometimes the line between observer and protector is drawn by a single decision, a single act of attention, a single moment when silence must give way to action. As time went on, the little girl continued to grow stronger, her laughter more genuine, her curiosity more vibrant, and her drawings increasingly filled with life, joy, and color, reflecting a mind no longer confined by fear, but expanding into trust and imagination. Each small step forward reminded me of the importance of empathy and vigilance, how critical it is to notice the signals of those who cannot yet speak for themselves, and how life's quiet interventions can leave lasting impact. I often walked past the house next door, now empty and quiet, and I could not help but reflect on the hidden realities that can exist behind ordinary facades, realizing that appearances are rarely the full story, and that vigilance and courage are sometimes required in even the most peaceful places. The experience had reshaped my understanding of the world, how easily danger can hide, how courage can be quiet, and how even small acts of attention and care can prevent harm and nurture resilience. I found myself sharing subtle lessons with neighbors, community members, and friends, emphasizing the importance of awareness, empathy, and readiness to act when something seems off, recognizing that the safety and well-being of others often depend on those willing to notice and respond. At home, I kept the little girl's drawings in the notebook as a reminder of what had been endured, what had been rescued, and what had been nurtured back into light. And each time I looked at them, I felt the quiet power of human resilience and the strength that comes from trust and care. I reflected on the months of tension, sleepless nights, and delicate decision-making, understanding that true resolution is a slow, patient process, not a sudden fix, and that healing and growth emerge from consistent support, attentiveness, and empathetic action. I also felt gratitude for the opportunity to make a difference, for the courage of the child who trusted me, and for the dedicated professionals whose coordinated efforts ensured her safety. Life returned to a gentle rhythm, yet the lessons remained vivid, shaping how I observed the world, responded to others, and valued the small, quiet acts of courage and compassion that often go unnoticed. In the evenings, as I sat quietly reflecting on the events, I realized that hope had been restored, not as a dramatic finale, but as a subtle, pervasive presence that could be seen in laughter, trust, and the reclaimed sense of safety that now surrounded the little girl. I understood, deeply, that life is fragile and resilience is precious, that listening carefully and acting with empathy can be the difference between continued fear and the possibility of growth, and that the impact of small decisions can ripple far beyond the immediate moment. Even the simplest acts, offering attention, noticing subtle cries for help, and responding with care can become turning points in someone else's story, shaping their future in profound ways. As I reflected on the journey, I felt a profound sense of closure. The turning point had passed, the resolution had taken hold, and the ending was not about forgetting the fear or erasing the past, but about the quiet triumph of trust, courage, and the nurturing of a safe space where hope could flourish. The little girl's voice, once tentative and fearful, now carried strength, confidence, and a sense of possibility. And in witnessing this transformation, I realized that endings are not truly endings. They are beginnings of a life reclaimed, a spirit strengthened, and a story of courage, empathy, and resilience that will continue to unfold. And in the calm of those reflective moments, I felt a lasting warmth, a quiet assurance that even in ordinary neighborhoods, extraordinary courage exists, and that when we notice, when we act with care, when we choose empathy over indifference, we participate in the creation of hope, restoration, and enduring human connection, leaving a subtle yet profound imprint on the lives we touch. A lesson that stays with both the healed and those who witness, shaping hearts and guiding actions long after the shadows have lifted and the ordinary street has returned to its quiet rhythm.